History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. In the middle of the 18th century, most people in the world and probably most Europeans could still believe that history would go on much as it had always done. The weight of the past was everywhere enormous, and often it was immovable. Some of the European efforts to shake it off have been touched upon, but nowhere outside Europe was even the possibility of doing so grasped. Though, in many parts of the world, a few people's lives had begun to be revolutionized by contact with the Europeans. Most of it was unaffected, and much of it was untouched by such contamination of traditional ways. Yet, even in the 18th century, the consciousness of historical change was spreading among thinking Europeans. In the next century and a half, change was to come thick and fast almost everywhere, and to ignore the fact was to be very hard, if not impossible. By 1900, it was obvious that in Europe and the European world of settlement, it had irreversibly cut off much of the traditional past. A fundamentally progressive view of history became more widely shared. If never unquestioned, the myth of progress more and more gave meaning to events. Just as important, impulses from Northern Europe and the Atlantic countries also radiated outwards to transform both Europe's relations with the rest of the world and the very foundations of their lives for many of its peoples, however much some of them regretted and resisted it. By the end of the 19th century, though this is only an approximate and convenient marker, a world once regulated by tradition was on a new course. Its destiny was now to be continuing and accelerating transformation, and the second adjective was as important as the first. A man born in 1800 who lived out the psalmist's span of three score years and 10 could have seen the world more changed in his lifetime than it had been in the previous 1,000 years. History was speeding up. The consolidation of the European world hegemony was central to these changes and one of the great motors propelling them. By 1900, European civilization had shown itself to be the most materially successful that had ever existed. They might not always agree on what was most important about it, but few Europeans could deny that it had produced wealth on an unprecedented scale and that it dominated the rest of the globe by power and influence as no previous civilization had ever done. Europeans or their descendants ran the world. Much of their domination was political, a matter of direct rule. Large areas of the world had been peopled by European stocks. As for the non European countries, still formally and politically independent of Europe, most of them had in practice to defer to European wishes and accept European interference in their affairs. Few indigenous peoples could resist, and if they did, Europe often won its subtlest victory of all. For successful resistance required the adoption of European practices and therefore Europeanization in another form. Chapter 1 Long Term Change. In 1798, Thomas Malthus, an English clergyman, published an essay on population, which was to prove the most influential book ever written on the subject. He described what appeared to be the laws of population growth, but his book's importance transcended this apparently limited scientific task. Its impact on, for example, economic theory and biological science was to be just as important as contribution it made to demographic studies. Here, though, such important consequences matter less than the book's status as an indicator of a change in thinking about population. Roughly speaking, for 2 centuries or so, European statesmen and economists had agreed that a rising population was a sign of prosperity. kings should seek to increase the number of their subjects. It was thought not merely because this would provide more taxpayers and soldiers, but because a bigger population both quickened economic life and was an indication that it had done so. Obviously, larger numbers showed that the economy was providing a living for more people. This view was, in its essentials, endorsed by no less than an authority than the great Adam Smith himself, whose Wealth of Nations, a book of huge influence, had agreed as recently as 1776 that an increase in population was a good rough test of economic prosperity. Malthus doused this view with very cold water. Whatever the consequences for society as a whole might be, judged to be, he concluded that a rising population sooner or later spelled disaster and suffering for most of its members, the poor. In a famous demonstration, he argued that the produce of the earth had finite limits, set by the amount of land available to grow food. This in turn set a limit to population. Yet population always tended to grow in the short run. As it grew, it would press increasingly upon a narrowing margin of subsistence. When this margin was exhausted, famine must follow. The population would then fall until it could be maintained with the food available. This mechanism could only be kept from operating if men and women abstained from having children, and prudence, as they regarded the consequences, might help them by encouraging late marriage or by such horrors as the natural checks imposed by disease or war. Much more could be said about the complexity and refinement of this gloomy thesis. It aroused huge argument and counter argument, and whether true or false, a theory attracting such attention must tell us much about the age. Somehow, the growth of population had begun to weary people so that even prose so unattractive as that of Malthus had great success. People had become aware of population growth as they had not been aware of it before and had done so just as it was to become faster than ever. In the 19th century, in spite of what Malthus had said, the numbers of some divisions of human race went up with a rapidity and to levels hitherto inconceivable. A long view is best for measuring such a change. There is nothing to be gained and much to be lost by worrying about precise dates, and the overall trends run on well into the 20th century. If we include Russia, whose population has until very recent times to be estimated from very poor statistics, then a European population of about 190 million in 1800 rose to about 420 million a century later. As the result of the world seems to have grown rather more slowly. This represented a rise in Europe's share of the total population of the world from about one fifth to one quarter for a little while. Her disadvantage in numbers by comparison with the great Asiatic centers of population was reduced, while she continued to enjoy her technical and psychological superiority. Moreover, at the same time, Europe was sustaining a huge immigration of her stocks. In the 1830s, European immigration overseas first passed the figure of 100,000 a year. In 1930, it was over a million and a half. Taking an even longer view, perhaps 50 million people left Europe to go overseas between 1840 and 1930, most of them to the Western Hemisphere. All these people and their descendants ought to be added to the totals in order to grasp how much European population growth accelerated in these years. This growth was not shared evenly within Europe, and this made important differences to the standing of great powers. Their strength was usually reckoned in terms of military manpower, and it was a crucial change that in 1871 Germany replaced France as the greatest mass of population under one government west of Russia. Another way of looking at such changes would be to compare the respective shares of Europe's population enjoyed by the major military powers at different dates. Between 1800 and 1900, for example, that of Russia grew from 21 to 24% of the total Germany's from 13 to 14, while France's fell from 15 to 10%, and that of Austria slightly less, from 15 to 12. Few increases, though, were as dramatic as that of the United Kingdom, which rose from about 8 million when Malthus wrote to 22 million by 1850. It was to reach 36 million by 1914. Yet the population grew everywhere, though at different rates at different times. The poorest agrarian regions of Eastern Europe, for example, experienced their highest growth rates only in the 1920s and 1930s. This is because the basic mechanism of population increase in this period, underlying change everywhere, was a fall in mortality. Never in history has there been so spectacular a fall in death rates as in the last 100 years, and it showed first in the advanced countries of Europe in the 19th century. Roughly speaking, before 1850, most European countries had birth rates which slightly exceeded death rates, and both were about the same in all countries. They showed, that is to say, how little impact had been made by that date upon the fundamental determinants of human life in a still overwhelmingly rural society. After 1880, this changed rapidly. The death rate in advanced European countries fell pretty steadily from about 35 per thousand inhabitants per year to about 28 by 1900. It would be about 1850 years later. Less advanced countries still maintained rates of 38 per thousand between 1850 and 1900 and 32 down to 1950. This produced a striking inequality between two Europes, in the richer of which expectation of life was much higher. Since in large measure advanced European countries lay in the West, this was, leaving out Spain, a poor country with high mortality, a fresh intensification of older divisions between East and the West, a new accentuation of the imaginary frontier from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Other factors besides lower mortality helped. Earlier marriage and a rising birth rate had shown themselves in the first phase of expansion as economic opportunity increased. But now they mattered much more since from the 19th century onwards, the children of earlier marriages were much more likely to survive thanks to greater humanitarian concern, cheaper food, medical and engineering progress, and better public health provision. Of these, medical science and the provision of medical services were the last to influence population trends. Doctors only came to grips with the great killing diseases from about 1870 onwards. These were the child killers: diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, typhoid. Infant mortality was thus dramatically reduced and expectation of life at birth greatly increased. But earlier than this, social reformers and engineers had already done much to reduce the incidence of these and other diseases, though not their fatality, by building better drains and devising better cleaning arrangements for the growing cities. Cholera was eliminated in the industrial countries by 1900, though it devastated London and Paris in the 1830s and 1840s. No Western European country had a major plague outbreak after 1899. As such, changes affected more and more countries. Their general tendency was everywhere to raise the average age of death with, in a long run, dramatic results. By the second quarter of the 20th century, men and women in North America, the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, and industrial Europe could expect to live 2 or 3 times as long as their medieval ancestors. Immense consequences flowed from this. Just as accelerated population increase first announced itself in those countries which were economically the most advanced, so did the slowing down of growth, which was the next discernible demographic trend. This was produced by a declining number of births, though it was for a long time masked because the fall in the death rate was even faster. In every society, this showed itself first among the better off. To this day, it remains a good rough working rule that fecundity varies inversely with income. Celebrated exceptions among wealthy American political dynasties notwithstanding. In some societies and in Western rather than Eastern Europe, this was because marriage tended to be put off longer so that women were married for less of their fertile lives. In some, it was because couples chose to have fewer children and could now do so with confidence thanks to effective contraceptive techniques. Possibly, there had been some knowledge of such techniques in some European countries. It is at least certain that the 19th century brought improvements in them, some made possible by scientific and technical advance in manufacturing the necessary devices, and propaganda which spread knowledge of them. Once more, a social change touches upon a huge ramification of influences because it is difficult not to connect such spreading knowledge with, for example, greater literacy and with the rising expectations. Although people were beginning to be wealthier than their ancestors, they were all the time adjusting their notion of what was a tolerable life and therefore a tolerable size of family. Whether they followed the calculation by putting off the date of marriage, as French and Irish peasants did, or by adopting contraceptive techniques, as the English and French middle classes seem to have done, was shaped by other cultural factors. Changes in the ways men and women died and lived in their families transformed the structures of society. On the one hand, the Western countries in 19th and 20th centuries had absolutely more young about and for a time also had them about in a greater proportion than ever before. It is difficult not to articulate much of the expansiveness, buoyancy, and vigor of 19th century Europe to this. On the other hand, advanced societies gradually found a higher proportion of their members surviving into the old age than ever before. This increasingly strained the social mechanisms which had in earlier centuries maintained the old and those incapable of work. The problem grew worse as competition for industrial employment became more intense. By 1940, in almost every European or North American country, much thought had been given to ways of confronting the problems of poverty and dependence, however great the differences in scale and success of efforts to cope with them. Such trends would not begin to show in Eastern Europe until after 1918, when their general pattern was already well established in the advanced Western countries. Death rate long continued to fall more sharply than did the birth rate, even in advanced countries, so that down to the present the population of Europe and the European world has continued to rise. It is one of the most important themes in the history of the era, linked to almost every other. Its material consequences can be seen in unprecedented urbanization and the rise of huge consumer markets for manufacturing industry. The social consequences range from strife and unrest to changing institutions to grapple with them. There were international repercussions as statesmen took into account population figures in deciding what risks they could and which they had to take, or as people became more and more alarmed about the consequences of overcrowding. Worries in the 19th century United Kingdom over the prospect of too many poor and unemployed led to the encouragement of immigration, which, in its turn shaped people's thinking and feelings about empire. Later, the Germans discouraged immigration because they feared the loss of military potential, while the French and Belgians pioneered the award of children's allowances for the same reason. Some of these measures suggest correctly that the gloomy prophecies of Malthus tended to be forgotten as the years went by, and the disasters he feared did not take place. The 19th century still brought demographic calamities to Europe. Ireland and Russia had spectacular famines, and near famine conditions occurred in many other places. But such disasters grew rarer. As famine and death were eliminated from advanced countries, this in turn helped to make disease demographically less damaging. Meanwhile, Europe, north of the Balkans, enjoyed two long periods of virtually undisturbed peace from 1815 to 1848 and from 1871 to 1914. War, another of Malthus's checks, also seemed to be less of a Scrooge. Finally, his diagnosis actually seemed to be disproved when a rise in population was accompanied by higher standards of living, as rises in the average age of death seems to show. Pessimists could only reply reasonably that Malthus had not been answered. All that had happened was that there had turned out to be much more food available than had been feared. It did not follow the supplies were it did not follow that supplies were limitless. In fact, there was occurring another of those few great historical changes which have truly transformed the basic conditions of human life. It can reasonably be called a fruit producing revolution. Its beginnings have already been traced. In the 18th century, European agriculture was already capable of obtaining about 2.5 times the yield on its seed normal in the Middle Ages. Now, even greater agricultural improvement was at hand. Yields would go up to still more spectacular levels. From about 1800, it has been calculated, Europe's agricultural productivity grew at a rate of about 1% a year, dwarfing all previous advance. More important still, as time passed, European industry and commerce would make it possible to tap huge larders in other parts of the world. Both of these changes were aspects of a single process, the accelerating investment in productive capacity which made Europe and North America by 1870 clearly the greatest concentration of wealth on the face of the globe. Agriculture was fundamental to it. People have spoken of an agricultural revolution, and provided this is not thought of as implying rapid change, it is an acceptable term. Nothing much less strong will describe the huge surge in the world output achieved between 1750 and 1870, and later even surpassed. But it was a process of great complexity, drawing on many different sources and linked to the other sectors of the economy in indispensable ways. It was only one aspect of a worldwide economic change which involved, in the end, not merely continental Europe, but the Americas and Australias as well. Once these important qualifications have been stated, it is possible to particularize by 1750. England had the best agriculture the world. The most advanced techniques were practiced, and the integration of agriculture with the commercial market economy had gone furthest in England, whose lead was to be maintained for another century or so. European farmers went there to observe methods, buy stock and machinery, and seek advice. Meanwhile, the English farmer benefited from peace at home. That there were no large scale and continuous military operations on British soil after 1650 was of literary incalculable benefit to the economy, and a rising population to buy his produce generated profits which provided capital for further improvement. His willingness to invest them in this way was, in the short run, an optimistic response to the likely commercial prospects, but also says something deeper about the nature of English society. The benefits of better farming went in England to individuals who owned their own land or held it securely as leaseholding tenants on terms shaped by market realities. England English agriculture was part of a capitalist market economy in which land was even by the 18th century treated almost as a commodity like any other. Restraints on its use, familiar in European countries, had disappeared faster and faster ever since Henry VIII's sequestration of ecclesiastical property. After 1750, the last great stage of this came with the spate of enclosure acts at the turn of the century, significantly coincident with high prices of grain, which mobilized for private profit the English peasants' traditional rights to pasture, fuel, or other economic benefits. One of the most striking contrasts between English and European agriculture in the early 19th century was that the traditional peasant all but disappeared in England. England had wage laborers and smallholders, but the huge European rural populations of individuals with some, if minuscule, legal rights, linking them to the soil through communal usages and a mass of tiny holdings, did not exist. Inside the framework provided by prosperity and English social institutions, technical progress was continuous. For a long time, much of this was hit and miss. Early breeders of better animals succeeded not because of the knowledge of chemistry, which was in its infancy, or of genetics, which did not exist, but because they backed hunches within long established practices. Even so, the results were remarkable. The appearance of the livestock inhabiting the landscape changed. The scraggy medieval sheep, whose backs resembled in section the Gothic arches of the monasteries which bred them, gave way to the fat, square, contented looking animals familiar today. Symmetry, well covered, was an 18th century farmer's toast. The appearance of farms changed as draining and hedging progressed, and big open medieval fields with their narrow strips, each cultivated by a different peasant, gave way to enclosed fields worked in rotation and made a huge patchwork of English countryside. In some of these fields, machinery was at work even by 1750. Much thought was given to its use and improvement in the 18th century, but it does not seem that it really made much of a contribution to output until after 1800, when more and more large fields became available and it became more productive in relation to costs. It was not long before steam engines were driving threshers. With their appearance in English fields, the way was open which would lead eventually to an almost complete replacement of muscular by machine power on the 20th century farm. Such improvements and changes spread mutatis mutandis and with a lag in time to continental Europe. Except by comparison with earlier centuries of quasi immobility, progress was not always rapid. In Calabria and Andalusia, it might be imperceptible over a century. Nevertheless, rural Europe changed, and the changes came by many routes. The struggle against the inelasticities of food supply was in the end successful, but it was the outcome of hundreds of particular victories over fixed crop rotations, outdated fiscal arrangements, poor standards of tillage and husbandry, and sheer ignorance. The gains were better stock, more effective control of plant blight and animal disease, the introduction of altogether new species, and much else. Change on so comprehensive a basis often had to work against the social and political grain too. The French formally abolished serfdom in 1789. This probably did not mean much, for there were few serfs in France at that date. The abolition of the feudal system in the same year was a much more important matter. What was meant by this vague term was the destruction of a mass of traditional and legal usages and rights which stood in the way of the exploitation of land by individuals as an investment like any other. Almost at once, many of the peasants who had thought they wanted this discovered that they did not altogether like it in practice. They discriminated. They were happy to abolish the customary dues paid to the lord of the manor, but did not welcome the loss of customary rights to common land. The whole change was made still more confusing and difficult to measure by the fact that there took place at the same time a big redistribution of property. Much land previously belonging to the church was sold within a few years to private individuals. The consequent increase in the number of people owning land outright and the growth in the average size of properties should, on the English analogy, have led to a period of great agricultural advance for France. But it did not. There was very slow progress and little consolidation of properties on the English pattern.